Hey everyone, tonight we start with the sun-drenched, olive oil-slicked world of ancient Greece, a society renowned for its democracy, philosophy, and statues that didn't believe in trousers. However, beneath the myths of Plato, Sparta, and golden temples, there is a far harsher reality because despite ancient. Before you settle in, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. In the comments, please let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to ancient Greece, where your day begins not with an alarm clock, but with the sun transforming your home into a slow cooker. Your home is a modest one made of sun-dried mud bricks or rough stone with small windows, and no glass, just wooden shutters to keep out the goats, and maybe some breeze if the gods are feeling generous. There's no insulation, no ceiling fan, and certainly no such thing as personal space. Unless you count the corner where the family goat doesn't sleep, you rise early not because you're disciplined, but because it's already too hot to stay horizontal in the summer. The stone walls absorb heat like a sponge, and by sunrise, your little house is radiating it back into your bones. In winter, those same walls turn into a freezer, and you're basically wrapped in a sheet, hopping not to become a statue of frostbite. You probably slept on a thin mat or a straw-stuffed mattress. No pillows, just a rolled-up cloak, or maybe your arm if you're lucky the lice left you alone last night. But probably not. There's no running water, so your morning routine involves either walking to the public fountain, or if you're rural, hauling water from a nearby well. You carry it in clay jars balanced on your shoulders while silently praying you don't trip and shatter a week's worth of back pain on the ground. To get clean, you don't bathe in the morning. That's saved for the end of the day. If at all, you might splash your face, rub some olive oil on your skin, then scrape it off with a strittle, a curved metal blade. Consider it a day at the spa. But without the spa itself, or any tangible impact, and don't even consider privacy. You haven't even eaten yet, and already your back hurts, you're sweating, and your tunic is sticking in places it shouldn't be. This is the best part of your day, so you've made it through the sweat box of a Greek bedroom, so it's time to refuel. Your family shares a room, and you sleep, eat, and fight over who brought mud in from the street, because the street doubles as your hallway, your news feed, and your trash dump. Welcome to breakfast in ancient Greece. This meal is so simple that it makes modern intermittent fasting seem gluttony. It's called maza, and it's made from ground barley mixed with water, shaped into flat cakes and baked either on hot stones or in the ashes of last night's fire. It's stale, dense, and about as exciting as the dirt. You might dunk it in watered-down wine because, surprise, the water isn't always safe to drink. There's no filtration system, no boiling, and no Bria pitcher in your clay pantry, so instead everyone, from children to the elderly, gets a cup of water mixed with water, not for the buzz, but for survival. If you're wealthy, you might get a fig or two, some olives, or a smudge of goat cheese, but let's face it, you're lucky if your bread doesn't crack a tooth when you bite into it. Absent coffee, unless you live close to a respectable beekeeper and know how to bribe them, there won't be any eggs, fruit bowls, or honey. Additionally, meals are quick. There won't be any chairs or spoons, and there won't be any attentive eating. In many houses, women and children eat separately after the men are finished, so in addition to the food being awful, you also get to wait your time to be let down. You chew, nod, and return to work. Oh, and if you're a woman, you don't even dine with the men. The irony: the same ancient Greeks who gave us symposiums, banquets, and poetic odes to wine also gave us breakfast, which is worthless. It's practical and frequently literally burned, but you eat it like a champion because it's the only thing separating you from a full day of sun, labor, and argument. Philosophers, it's time to freshen up, or more accurately, fail to, since in ancient Greece, hygiene wasn't so much about cleanliness as it was about ritual, oil, and soap, a fantasy saved for later centuries. Bong appetite, just try not to crack a myrrh now that you've choked down your stale barley brick and a splash of wine water. Unless you're fortunate enough to live next to a bathhouse, which most people don't because there isn't any shampoo, your morning bath often consists of splashing cold water over your body at the public fountain or courtyard basin. Instead of using a sponge or minty body wash, unless you stole one from a sponge diver in the Aeon, you use olive oil. You rub the oil into your skin to collect sweat and dirt, not to moisturize, and then you use a strittle with a curved bronze blade to scrape it off, leaving you feeling less greasy but still a little dubious. Imagine your skincare routine: slathering yourself with salad dressing and then shaving it off. If you think that sounds luxurious, keep in mind that everyone else does it far too frequently in public places. Loudly nude in ancient Greece, cleanliness was social. Let's talk about teeth now. There are no toothbrushes or toothpaste, so you may either rinse with vinegar or rub your gums with crushed charcoal if you're feeling fancy, but most of the time you just chew on a twig and hope for the best. Dental hygiene is more about divine mercy than regular care. Perfumes are available for those who can afford them, but body odor is non-existent. For example, you might rub some myrrh or rose oil on your neck just before walking 5 miles in sandals through the Athenian heat. This creates a distinctively Greek combination of musk dust and desperate laundry. The oil and scrape method helps, but only so much when you're sweating in a tunic under a sun that's trying to kill you. So yes, ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, and architecture, but a decent shower is still waiting. Rare clothes are washed by beating them against stones in the river if you're poor, and your tunic probably hasn't seen water since last festival season. In other words, hygiene in ancient Greece wasn't about looking or smelling good, but rather about appearing somewhat less revolving than yesterday. You have two choices now that you've grease-scraped your way into a new day, but be warned. Your ancient Greek attire is, at best, sparse and at worst, hilariously unworkable. A kitten or a H-mation are essentially large rectangles of linen that you wrap, tie with a belt, or fasten with a brooch. They are not fitting or tailored, and they were definitely not made with windy days in mind. One bad gust and your entire philosophical perspective is suddenly on display. Let's talk about footwear. If you're lucky, you have a pair of leather sandals. If not, you're barefoot and will be walking on sun-baked stone, goat-trodden dirt, and whatever the local market has squished into the roads. Imagine walking across a skillet in July while dodging donkey dung. That's your daily commute. Of course, there is no sun protection. Forget about underwear. It doesn't exist, and bras don't exist, so unless you're a Spartan woman trained to sprint and wrestle, you're just hopping your pin's hold and nobody notices your wardrobe shifting like a loose curtain. No hats, unless you're a farmer or sailor, and no sunscreen because you live in 450 BCE when science hasn't been invented yet. The Aeon sun doesn't care how philosophical you are. By noon, your shoulders will be burned, your feet will be filthy, and your linen robe will have stuck to you in 4 places that defy geometry. Additionally, public nudity isn't shocking in Greek society. You may see men working out in the buff at the gym, or even politicians giving speeches in togas that hardly hold together. If you're wealthy, your tunic may be dyed, perhaps a soft purple or saffron yellow, but most people wear off-white or brown because dyes are expensive, and no one wants to waste good color on the man who fixes fishnets for a living. You spend your day wearing a toga burrito, sweating, hopping your pin doesn't come loose in front of the priestess, and worst of all, you're only halfway through your chores. If you're a free male citizen, especially in Athens or Sparta, congratulations. You're automatically a soldier whether you like it or not by the time you're in your teens, training with wooden weapons and learning formations in the phalanx, that famous Greek battle strategy that involves standing shoulder to shoulder behind large shields and hopping the guy next to you doesn't trip in Sparta. Welcome to ancient Greece, where military service isn't a job. It's your civic duty, your social expectation, and sometimes your one-way ticket to an early grave. In the harsh AOG system, which turns kids into warriors by essentially starving, whipping, and isolating them until only the strongest survive in Athens, boys begin military training at age 7. The requirements are milder but still mandatory. 2 years of training in your late teens, followed by decades of being on call. You don't get to say, I'm more of a thinker. There's always a fight, whether it is Sparta versus Athens, and even philosophers like Socrates fought in them, although not with clever retorts using real weapons. Persia versus Athens, if you can afford it, you get a bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, round-hop shield, and spear. If not, try to avoid being in the front row. Leather and cloth don't stop arrows, and the worst part, you supply your own gear. Sparta versus literally everyone or just a neighboring palace getting sassy about trade routes is a way of life. Peace is simply the pause between 2 invasions. Serving in the military is a Bob scenario. When you're not fighting, you're preparing training, cleaning weapons, debating strategy in the assembly, or rowing warships for hours as a member of the Navy because, yes, those triams don't paddle themselves. There's no veterans' health care, no pensions, no therapy, just scars, limps, and the occasional gravestone that praises your courage and virtue. Poorer citizens either beg, borrow, or fight with light weapons, which is Greek for more likely to die first. If you think that life as a man in ancient Greece sounds difficult, wait until you learn that women in the majority of Greek city-states, particularly Athens, had fewer rights than a pile of ornamental urns. They were not allowed to vote, hold public office, own land outright, or appear in public without a male escort. In fact, if you were out too frequently, people might begin to whisper that you were a courtesan or worse, a Spartan. Begin with your everyday schedule. You get up early to begin your chores, which include spinning wool, weaving cloth, grinding grain, fetching water, baking bread, and so on. Oversee the slaves, if any, and rear the kids. You are the head of the family, but without compensation, respect, or vacation days, your social life is restricted. You don't go to plays or participate in philosophical discussions. You're primarily confined to the women's quarters, the gyasam, and you're not at the gym, which is for nude men. Your only exposure to the outside world is through laddies' work windows and education. If you're lucky, you might pick up some reading skills, but otherwise you're trained in household chores. For the males, there is philosophy, rhetoric, and geometry. It's your responsibility to get married, have sons, and remain invisible while doing it. Your father arranges your marriage to a man twice your age when you are young, usually in your early teens, and he treats you more like a business deal than a human being. Love is optional. Sparta was an exception to the rule that dowries are required, and that your womb becomes your greatest value once you have children. Spartan women were renowned for being more free. They could own property, exercise in public, and receive an education. However, before you become very envious, keep in mind that their independence resulted from a state-sponsored preoccupation with eugenics and war. As a Spartan woman, your primary responsibility is to bear strong warriors or face shame. If your husband passes away, you are unable to inherit much, you are unable to remarry without permission, and your options become more limited than your social circle. You are also frequently physically and legally trapped, so yes, the Greeks worshipped strong goddesses. Athena, Artemis, Hea, but true women were supposed to keep to themselves, stay at home, and be invisible. Ancient Athens is hailed as the birthplace of democracy, and yes, technically that's true. But before you get too excited, let's be clear, you probably wouldn't qualify to participate. In fact, the majority of people living in Athens were completely excluded from the democratic process to vote in the Athenian Ecclesia Assembly. You had to be male-born to Athenian parents, a citizen over 18. That means women foreigners called medics slaves and children, who made up nearly 90% of the population. Had no political voice whatsoever. That's not democracy for the people, that's democracy for a very specific club of sunburned men in sandals. If you met the criteria, though you didn't just vote, you were expected to participate constantly. Laws were proposed, debated, and passed in huge assemblies of thousands of citizens. There were no career politicians. Every eligible man was part legislator, part jury member, and part overconfident amateur. You could even be randomly chosen to serve in powerful positions like running the treasury or serving on a jury through a lottery system, which sounds thrilling until you remember there were no qualifications. Perhaps your fishmonger is in charge of military logistics. One day, your uncle, who still thinks that sea monsters exist, might preside over a murder trial tomorrow. If someone became too powerful, too well-liked, or just irritated people. Ostracism. Every year, citizens could write a person's name on a broken piece of pottery or an ostracon and vote to exile them for 10 years without a trial or defense. Despite these flaws, Athenian democracy was revolutionary because it gave ordinary men a voice. Well, some ordinary men, and laid the foundation for future political systems. However, it wasn't fair or inclusive. If you were a woman, you could silence a foreign-born resident who paid taxes, silence a slave building, and the Parthenon undoubtedly silenced a philosopher who raised too many questions. Slavery wasn't just accepted in ancient Greece. It was expected that even modest households had at least one slave, not because the family was wealthy, but because slavery was so ingrained in society that it felt as normal as sandals and sunburn. Democracy may have been implemented in ancient Greece, but if you had arrived expecting equal rights and inclusive politics, you would have been escorted out of the assembly and told to bring your own ostracon. Slaves were not of any particular race or ethnicity. They were from conquered lands, including Thrians, Ceans, Syrians, and even fellow Greeks from the wrong city-state at the wrong time. Some were born into slavery, others were POWs, and some were abducted and sold. It was a thriving, cruel market, and business was always good. The idea that someone might not own another human being is practically unthinkable. If you lived in Athens, your slave probably took care of everything: cooking, fetching water, cleaning, caring for your kids, carrying shopping, and standing quietly during dinner. Some even took care of business or ran the household while the citizen owner relaxed at the symposium. Drinking diluted wine and discussing abstract ideas like justice and irony at the highest level possible in the Loron slaves' silver mines. where children worked in appalling conditions, crawling through narrow shafts in complete darkness, breathing in poisonous dust, and gradually dying for the sake of money and public pride. Some slaves received an education. They worked as scribes, taught grammar and math, or even handled bank accounts. However, they were still considered property and might be slain, branded, beaten, or sold at any time. In contrast to later slave regimes, there was no mass abolitionist movement, and the few who achieved freedom, known as freedmen, were never really free since they still owed allegiance to their former masters. They were also denied citizenship, the right to vote, and the right to own land, only the prospect of a little better future. Philosophers like Aristotle did, in fact, defend slavery as natural and necessary, arguing that some people were slaves by nature. Isn't it fascinating that ancient Greece gave us philosophy, ethics, and democracy, but all of that was founded on the backs of people who were never given the opportunity to speak, vote, or matter, and that's not a footnote. The sad thing about feeling ill in ancient Greece is that, unless you live next door to Hippocrates himself, your health care plan consists of a lot of wishful thinking, hazy herbal remedies, and supernatural intervention. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Hospitals as we know them do not exist. The most well-known Greek doctors were actually a combination of herbalists, philosophers, and gamblers who believed in the four humors. If you're ill or injured, you stay at home. Perhaps your neighbor knows a little bit about picuses. Perhaps a family member remembers a prayer to Asclepius, the god of healing. Perhaps your local temple has a snake you can pet for spiritual comfort. According to them, disease was brought on by an imbalance in these fluids, so if you had a fever with too much blood, try draining it with a cough and coughing up too much phlegm. If you had black bile, try fasting. Perhaps go on a stroll or gaze at the sea in awe. The majority of treatments relied on trial and error, and you might be prescribed garlic. Crushed poppy seeds, good luck with that, boiled figs, a vinegar compress, and something someone scraped off a goat. Did it work or did it hurt? Surgery is almost always a last resort without anesthesia or antiseptics. Even a small cut could become septic and kill you. Tools included iron knives, bone saws, and a lot of prayers. If you needed something amputated, I hope you brought a leather strap to bite down on. Midwives handled childbirth, which was dangerous. Even on the best days, the mortality rates for women and infants were tragically high. If you were wealthy, you might call a traveling doctor with a real scroll and some fancy oils. Yes, ancient Greek medicine gave us the Hippocratic Oath, but it also gave us treatments like drinking boiled cabbage water. If you were poor, you had to rely on local knowledge, street remedies, and sheer fortitude, or you just didn't recover. However, at least they believed in rest, clean air, and a balanced diet. Hope and perseverance in classical Greece theater was more than just entertainment. It was a civic obligation, a religious rite, and occasionally a full-contact sport for the soul. To begin, theater was free for all citizens, assuming you weren't a foreigner or a woman slave, in which case you wouldn't be able to see anything. Instead, you would be crammed into a massive outdoor theater carved into a hillside, similar to the great theater of Dionysus in Athens, along with thousands of other sweaty locals, and you would be there all day long. The Dionysia festival ran from dawn until night, featuring back-to-back tragedies, comedies, and satyr plays. The plays themselves were heartbreaking tragedies, murderous mayhem, and there was no intermission, no food, and definitely no bathroom breaks unless you counted a bush on the hillside. If you arrived late or acted out, you might not only be scowled at but also punished. Then came the comedies, which weren't exactly lighthearted family fare. These plays ridiculed politicians, philosophers, entire cities, and bodily functions with stunning precision. Imagine if Saturday Night Live and a college debate had a baby, then dressed it in a giant phallic costume and sent it on stage. Actors wore tall masks, platform shoes, and exaggerated costumes, all male, of course, even for women's roles. The chorus sang, danced, and shouted commentary like an ancient Greek version of Twitter, only louder and wearing tunics. This wasn't passive viewing. The audience was loud, booed, hissed, threw objects, and argued during the performance. You were never just watching in the theater. You were actively participating and perhaps even throwing olives, so you survived your tragic all-day theater binge. Now you wander into the agora, the bustling center of the city, and stumble straight into a man in a cloak, holding no shoes, asking strangers, "What is justice?" If the play offended you, you told them. If it moved you, you shouted, wept, and perhaps reevaluated your life. At the end of the festival, a jury voted on which playwright won. Greetings, philosophy is ubiquitous and mandatory in ancient Greece, especially in Athens. The local sport was philosophy. and the winners' names are now linked to revolutionary concepts. Back then, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were all just strange men who talked a lot and made other people feel foolish. For example, Socrates made it his career to ask pointless questions and undermine people's faith in their own judgments. You might be going about your own business, buying olives, or petting a stray goat. And he would ask, "Do you believe in truth?" Which led to 3 hours of mental turmoil and a desire to relocate to Sparta. He never wrote anything down. Plato, his student, did that, but Socrates made an impression because, in part, Athens executed him for being too obnoxious, claiming that his actions were corrupting the youth and making them doubt the gods. However, let's be honest, he probably just wouldn't stop asking questions during dinner. Philosophy wasn't a comfortable academic pastime. Rather, it was a loud, confrontational, and strangely athletic debates that took place in public places, were spontaneous, intense, and frequently ended in hurt feelings or profound existential crises. If you thought you could just watch, think again. There are no microphones, only voices, hands, and enough ego to fill the pathon. Philosophers enjoyed attracting random onlookers. You didn't pass Plato's academy because you were engrossed in it. You said something a little incorrectly, and it became the day's poster child for an unquestioned existence, even if children weren't safe. Aristotle provided tutoring. Think about the high school civics teacher who handed you a globe and said, "Go fix this." Alexander the Great was a teenager who went on to conquer half of the world. So yes, philosophy gave us logic, ethics, science, and political theory. But in ancient Greece, it also gave you a headache, a crisis of identity, and a 70% chance of being publicly humiliated by a man in sandals. So you've made it in ancient Athens. You're well-spoken, clever, politically active people like you may be too much. That's your first mistake. Because in Athens, being too popular could get you kicked out of the city for 10 years, not arrested, not fined, just gone. This wasn't a conspiracy. Backroom deal. It was built into the system. It was called ostracism. And it was perfectly legal, perfectly public, and perfectly terrifying. Once a year, the citizens of Athens would gather to decide whether to hold an ostracism vote. If enough people agreed, everyone wrote the name of a person they wanted exiled on a broken piece of pottery called an ostracon. If someone got 6,000 or more votes, they were banished. No trial, no explanation, just pack your sandals and leave. You didn't have to. Criminal, in fact, most ostracized people had done nothing wrong, except get too influential. Maybe you were a war hero, a persuasive speaker, or just had great hair. Whatever it was, your fellow citizens decided you were becoming a threat to democracy, and democracy voted to yeet you into temporary oblivion. And here's the twist: Aristides, the just, was so popular that someone allegedly voted against him, because they were tired of hearing how virtuous he was. Even the military genius who saved Athens at the Battle of Salamis, Theosticles, was expelled once he became too arrogant. However, it turns out that gratitude has an expiration date. The ostracism lasted for 10 years, after which you could return as if nothing had happened. Your property was unaltered. Your citizenship remained untarried, and you had a 10-year vacation without asking for. Ostracism was intended to shield Athens from tyrants, but it frequently penalized success. So if you were ambitious, you had to tread carefully. You should be respected but not overly so, popular but not charismatic enough to worry people. Think of it like a reality show where the prize for gaining too many fans is being banished to the countryside with your dignity and olive oil stash. Athens also created cancel culture 2,500 years ahead of schedule. In ancient Greece, people didn't ask if they would die young. Instead, they wondered how soon and how painfully. Life expectancy was roughly 30 to 35 years, assuming you survived infancy, which was no small accomplishment. About 1 in 3 children died during childhood as a result of illness, inadequate nutrition, and poor hygiene, which is more theoretical than practical, as we've discussed. You could die from anything, such as a scratch that became septic or a fever, and no one could explain why childbirth is a major cause of death for women, or something as basic as drinking the wrong cup of water. Disease spread quickly in crowded cities with little access to medicine and inconsistent divine intervention. Epidemics became commonplace due to open-air sewers and communal fountains. For example, during the Peloponnesian War, the infamous plague of Athens destroyed a third of the city. Socrates wrote about it, and he managed to survive, but most people weren't so fortunate. Even if you weren't killed in battle, the odds were that you would die holding a spear or rowing a try. Even if you weren't killed in battle, your wounds would often turn fatal days later, with no antibiotics or stitches, just hope and garlic compresses. Additionally, there was always the possibility of dying from a divine tantrum, insulting a god, forgetting a sacrifice, mocking a temple statue, or disparaging Zeus after 3 cups of wine. Burial rites were crucial. If your family was unable to pay for a dignified funeral that included rites to guarantee your place in the afterlife and money for the ferrymen, you might be abandoned outside the city gates, forgotten and unmarked. The Greeks believed that unburied spirits wandered perpetually imprisoned between worlds. Death wasn't poetry, it was everyday, and it didn't care about your philosophy, your beauty, or your ancestry. It wasn't simply tragic, but it was also spiritually perilous. A rotting fig or an enraged insect could kill you even whether you were a poet, a general, or a slave. In principle, ancient Greek religion was all about harmony with the divine, worshipping Zeus, and the Greeks had 12 Olympians, and none of them liked you. In reality, the Golden Crew, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, and the others, up on Mount Olympus were constantly controlling spiritual harm. These gods weren't kind, loving beings. Rather, they were heavenly drama queens with superpowers who would destroy your crops if you made a sacrifice. Saying the wrong prayer causes your ship to drown. Entering the wrong grove results in snake bites, pestilence, and starvation. Choose what you want. The gods required immaculate rituals, unwavering obedience, and precise timing in addition to your loyalty. You had daily rituals rather than weekly temple visits. Civic rituals, home altars, and seasonal celebrations prior to crop planting offer to Ares sailing by water. Pour out some wine to Poseidon and maybe throw in a goat just for safety. And pray to Data before she goes to fight. There were favorites and grudges for every god. Apollo might protect your city, unless your grandfather offended him once, in which case you're cursed. Until further notice, Hera was the goddess of marriage. But she also specialized in making mortal women's lives miserable. If Zeus so much as looked at them, Athena rewarded wisdom and also turned people into spiders casual. And if the Olympians weren't enough to keep you nervous, there were nymphs, satyrs, spirits, river gods, and monsters lurking around every corner step on the wrong patch of sacred land. And suddenly your left leg belongs to a vengeful woodland sprite. But worst of all, you never knew why something bad happened. Was it the wrong offering, the wrong timing? Did you insult a god in a dream? Maybe. It was your cousin, maybe. It was something your great-grandfather. It doesn't matter, the gods work in mysterious and deeply personal ways. And yet, for all the terror, Greek religion was woven into every part of life, from politics to childbirth to the Olympic Games. You feared the gods, yes, but you also depended on them. The sun-baked dwellings and barley-bread meals came after everything. Their temples were city landmarks, their festivals were national holidays, and their mythology explained everything from lightning to love. They didn't believe in gods out of faith, but rather out of survival instinct, tres blistering from the sandal. Gods are plagued by battles and tragedies associated to goats, to put it simply. Would you survive even a day in ancient Greece? Actually, you would fold before lunch because of the heat, the diet, and the ongoing fear of war or divine retribution, which would completely destroy your Instagrammable toga ideal. You're not accustomed to sitting over a hole in the ground near a temple or carrying water before breakfast. You would miss your flowing water, goat. Your right to complain without being banished by ceramic shards, and your aspirin. You may adore the thought of living among marble statues of great epic poets and philosophers, but guess what? For the other 1% of ancient Greece, backbreaking labor, restricted rights, and regular funerals were the norm. Your democracy only if you're a man. Take garlic as medicine, and pray that your gods are constantly angry on social media. A guy yelling in the agora about justice while waving a fish. And yet for all of that the Greeks endured. They built temples that still stand, wrote plays, we still perform, debated ideas. We still wrestle with, and laid the groundwork for everything from astronomy to ethics. They didn't just survive hardship, they created civilization. While sweating through it, you wouldn't last. But they did not because life was easy, but because they found ways to make meaning in a world full of chaos. They questioned everything, fought constantly, wrote beautifully, died young, and still somehow shaped the modern world. So no, you probably wouldn't make it past your first sunstroke, goat bite, or unsolicited philosophy lesson in the street. But if you did, if you adapted, endured, and listened closely, you'd find yourself standing among some of the most passionate, resilient, and brilliantly flawed people history has ever known. And they wouldn't judge you for struggling, they'd just hand you a tunic, point to the amphui, and say, good, now carry that up a hill. Prasutagus, the king of the Aini tribe in what is now eastern England, had played the Roman game brilliantly and had walked a tightrope for years, ruling as a client king under the shadow of Rome. He had wealth, autonomy, and peace as long as he remained useful to the empire. But when he passed away in about 60 AD, he left behind a will intended to protect his people. He named the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his two young daughters in the hopes that this act of loyalty would ensure their safety and sovereignty. But he was mistaken. Rome disregarded the will, negotiated nothing, and seized the Iceni kingdom without hesitation. Their soldiers stormed in and took everything, including lands, livestock, homes, and treasures. But what they did next turned a political insult into a personal hell. They publicly flogged Queen Boudica to humiliate her and send the message that she was nothing, and if that wasn't enough, they also abused her daughters in front of her. This wasn't just a crackdown, it was psychological warfare, the kind designed to break a people's spirit, but it didn't break. Boudica, it forged her Rome, believed it had crushed a minor tribal woman beneath its boot. What it had done was awaken a lioness, a queen who would take her pain, and reshape it into vengeance, a mother, whose rage would soon set cities ablaze, a woman who would remind Rome that even empires bleed. Word of the atrocity spread quickly through Britannia. Other tribes listened, they remembered their own humiliations, their own land losses, their own sons killed in Roman campaigns. Rome thought the tribes divided scattered, but in that moment they had one thing in common: Boudica's fury. What began with Rome violating one queen would soon end with the empire reeling in fear. They had broken a treaty, broken a family, and in doing so broken the illusion of Roman invincibility in Britannia. This wasn't just a mistake, it was the spark that would ignite one of the most ferocious revolts Rome ever faced. If Rome expected Boudica to fade into silence, they misunderstood everything about her. Boudica wasn't born to obey, she was born to lead. Described by Roman historians, who rarely complimented their enemies, as tall, fierce, with flaming red hair cascading down to her waist, and a voice that sliced through crowds like a war horn, she wasn't just a queen by blood, she was a symbol. And now she was a threat. But before she became that threat, she became something deeper, a mother with nothing left to lose. Roman brutality had tried to erase her dignity, her children's future, and her people's pride. But Boudica refused to be a victim. She understood what Rome feared most wasn't an army, it was unity. And so she began to forge it one tribe at a time. First, the Trinantes. They had once been powerful before Rome crushed them under taxes, land seizures, and slave labor. When Boudica spoke, she didn't speak like a diplomat, she spoke like a warrior mother, scarred. But unbroken, she reminded them of their ancestors, of their gods, and of the earth. They no longer owned her pain. Was their pain her rage? Theirs too. Then the other tribes began to listen. The Coral Talvi, the Corinovi, even some of the Brigantes. Her cause was no longer about vengeance. It became a holy mission to cleanse Britannia of Roman arrogance. She didn't promise safety. She promised glory and death with honor if it came to that. And they followed her because she did not stand behind her warriors. She rode among them, spear in hand, hair loose to the wind eyes. Locked on the future, she called out the names of the raped, the enslaved, the executed. She summoned gods like Andros, the Celtic war goddess, as her witness. And her warriors believed her. When she said the gods would fight with them, she had no formal military training, no Roman strategy scrolls. But she had something deadlier: righteous fury sharpened by betrayal, guided by purpose. And the land itself seemed to shift under her command. This wasn't rebellion, it was resurrection. The queen Rome thought it had broken was now the spearhead of a movement that would soon make the empire tremble. And she was just getting started. The Roman eagle had long soared over Britannia. But now the winds beneath its wings were changing. Boudica's fury wasn't a wildfire, it was a storm building, with terrifying purpose. And storms need fuel. That fuel came from the thousands of Britons who had waited years, generations, even for someone to defy the empire. She gave them a voice by speaking in blood and iron rather than Latin. It began with war conferences conducted under moonlit hills and hallowed groves. Boudica stood in the dirt with her people, not on a throne, and heard the cries of mothers, the rage of tribal elders, and the chants of druids who saw omens in the sky. They all spoke of the same truth. Rome had gone too far, and now it was time to drive back warriors from the Trinovantes, who brought spears, slings, and old battle chants. The Aini added cavalry, swift riders with wild hair, and war paint fierce, and fearless. Other tribes joined with axes, blades, and torches. Even women took up arms inspired by their queen. This wasn't just an army forming, it was a resurrection of Celtic identity. But Rome had trained legions, professional soldiers, armored, disciplined, and lethal. Boudica had to make up for that with numbers, knowledge of the land, and something Rome could never teach: hatred forged in humiliation. Soon Boudica's army swelled to tens of thousands. Farmers became warriors, hunters became assassins, former Roman slaves and mistreated tribal allies switched sides. These weren't soldiers who fought for pay, they fought for memory, revenge, and the right to raise children without chains. She gave a speech, her first of many. Roman historians would later record her words, albeit with their bias. But what echoes through time is clear: she vowed to win or die. There would be no surrender, no submission, no turning back. Then came the first target, Camulaginum, British stronghold that was later turned into a Roman colony with temples, statues, and villas. The Temple of Claudia stood as a shrine to the emperor who had defeated Boudica and her warriors. It was not sacred. Rather, it was a provocation, and it would be the first to fall. The tribes were no longer muttering rebellion. Instead, they were marching toward it, armed with wrath and led by a queen who would not bow down. The once proud Roman colony had turned into a symbol of everything that Boudica's people hated. Its streets echoed not with tribal chants but with Latin commands. Its buildings rose to the top of sacred ground, and at the top of it all stood the Temple of Claudius, a marble mockery constructed with forced labor that praised the emperor who had brought the Britons to Rome. It was a monument to Boudica. She gave the order, and what transpired wasn't a siege but rather death. Her army came down like a tidal wave, surprising the Roman settlers. Many of them were veterans who had taxed and harassed the native tribes. The city lacked adequate defenses. The small number of Roman soldiers there were ill-prepared, expecting peace rather than conflict, and they attempted to hold the temple by barricading themselves within, thinking it could withstand a siege, but it failed within 2 days. When Boudica's army broke through, the streets turned scarlet and no men were spared. Children and mothers were massacred. In addition to being military, Boudica's war was also personal. Her men set fire to villas, damaged Roman statues, and directed their wrath on the very objects of occupation. The temple was set on fire, its roof collapsing in a conflagration that illuminated the sky for kilometers. There were few survivors, and those who did manage to flee brought with them stories of horror that chilled Roman blood. The rage wasn't random, it was purposeful. These were people who had seen their homes taken, their gods ridiculed, their daughters sold, and now they were reclaiming what had been stolen. By the time Roman officials heard of Camulaginum's fall, it was already ash and smoke, a colony destroyed, its citizens dead, and the flame of rebellion rising higher. Boudica didn't stay to celebrate because she knew Rome would react harshly, so she persisted, knowing that every victory gave her momentum, and her next stop was a city bigger, richer, and even more vulnerable. Camulaginum was the start, but it wasn't retaliation until the imperial heart in Britain sensed the flames. Had Rome not previously taken her seriously, they would now. Londinium was the jewel of Roman Britannia, founded just 17 years earlier. It had grown into a thriving hub of trade and administration. Merchants from across the empire filled its markets. Officials conducted imperial business. Under tiled roofs, wealth flowed through its streets like water. But as Boudica's army marched ever closer, that wealth turned into panic. Governor Suonius, having rushed back from Wales with a small force, arrived just ahead of the rebellion. He looked at Londinium, crowded, sprawling, defenseless, and made a brutal decision. He abandoned it. The Roman legions stationed elsewhere were too far to help. Suetonius couldn't risk his limited troops in a city that couldn't be defended. So he withdrew, taking with him those who could flee. He left behind the old, the sick, the stubborn, and those too slow to believe a woman-led army could bring down Rome. They would learn otherwise. Boudica's forces swept into Londinium like a thunderclap. There were no walls to scale, no gates to breach. The city was open, and she made it bleed. Her warriors tore through streets with the rage of generations. They didn't loot, they didn't occupy, they eradicated. The killing was systematic. Roman citizens were dragged from their homes, entire families were butchered, some were impaled, others burned alive in temples. No quarter was given, and no Roman symbol was spared. Villas were set on fire, warehouses burst into flames, and rising smoke, curling black against the British sky, could be seen for miles. This wasn't simply a massacre, it was a statement. According to modern Roman authors like Tacitus and Cassius Dio, tens of thousands of people perished, proving that Rome is not unbeatable. According to other reports, the violence went beyond even what happened at Camulaginum. In Roman minds, this was the end of the world, not only a rebellion, and through it all rode, instead of hiding behind commanders, Boudica led a chariot with her daughters at her sides and watched as the empire's pride fell apart beneath her. To her, this wasn't senseless violence. Rather, it was justice for what Rome had done to her family, people, and land. She wasn't done, though, because another Roman center, Verilium, stood in front of her, and beyond that, Rome's full retaliation. Rome had previously experienced uprisings and fought wars on several continents, but it had never seen anything like Boudica. She wasn't a general trained in tactics. She didn't speak Latin, and she didn't wear polished armor, but she had destroyed 2 Roman cities and slaughtered thousands of soldiers and citizens. Now that the empire was in flames, word of her rampage had reached the Roman Senate, and Emperor Nero reportedly contemplated leaving Britannia entirely because of one woman with a chariot and a cause. In actuality, her power lay not only in her army but in what she stood for. Rome saw itself as unshakable, its cities as eternal, its rule as destiny. Now spearheading an uprising that has destroyed entire Roman communities, the burning of each new city was more than just a military win. It was a psychological blow. Verulamium was wealthy and met the same end as Camulaginum and Londinium. Romanized and totally undefended, Boudicca's warriors massacred the locals, demolished temples, and leveled Roman infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from today still reveals a thick layer of ash beneath the present-day town, where a fire burned so fiercely that it left a scar on the ground. However, there was a paradox with every victory. The weight of Boudicca's military machine increased. Her army grew, but her supply lines dwindled, her organization faltered, some tribes became reckless, and Rome, known for its tenacity, was regrouping. Governor Suetonius wasn't idle. He had retreated, yes, but not surrendered. He started assembling reinforcements, drawing battle-hardened legions from all over the province. He sought the high ground, studied the terrain, and prepared for one decisive battle. But even with Roman strength rebuilding, there was a nagging fear in every soldier's heart. Could they stop her? Because Boudicca wasn't just waging war. She was rewriting the story of conquest, proving city after burning city that Rome could bleed and queens could retaliate. The final confrontation was approaching, and the empire held its breath. The fire had spread as far as it could, and now the storm had to face steel governor Gas Suetonius. Pinus was a survivor while Boudicca's men celebrated their wins, and he had picked his battlefield wisely. He wasn't just any Roman general. Suetonius was strategic. He chose a small defile, a tight area surrounded by hills and forest, where Boudicca's numerical advantage would be minimal. His army was small, perhaps 10,000 strong, but every man was a skilled killer who had been forged in the discipline of the legions. On the other hand, according to some accounts, up to 200,000 warriors marched under her banner, but they weren't soldiers. Rather, they were farmers, blacksmiths, tribal chiefs, and freedom seekers who were inspired but undisciplined, armed with rage but without formation. They thought that sheer numbers would crush Rome like a tide, but they were mistaken. As Butta's army drew near, she gave a final speech while standing atop her war chariot, flanked by her daughters, reminding them of their suffering from rapes, floggings, stolen lands, and burned homes, and she invoked the goddess. After calling upon the ancestors and promising them either victory or death, Andri's warriors roared in response, thinking the gods would carry them. The battle then broke out as Britain charged, filling the field with a primordial rage, but Suetonius held firm, allowing them to get close while crammed into the small space. Then, at precisely the right moment, he unleashed the Roman counterstrike, sending the spears flying in tight formation. The Romans advanced step by step, disciplined and merciless behind the Briton wagons and families, who had followed the army expecting to witness Roman defeat, but instead they became a fatal obstacle that the warriors couldn't retreat from. Panic set in the narrow battlefield turned into a slaughter when the dust settled, and tens of thousands of Britons lay dead. Shields locked, short, and sleek Roman swords cut deep into the confused mass as wave after wave of Britons crashed into an iron wall, and each time they broke. The empire was bent but not destroyed by the uprising, but Boudicca had thrown everything at Rome, and even if she lost the fight, the memory of her stand would reverberate more loudly than the sound of swords clashing. Although her ultimate destiny would remain unknown, her tale would live on forever. There are no eyewitness accounts of her last breath, no precise details of her death, and the ground was covered in the blood of her people, and the ashes of their dreams drifting into the cold British air. The battlefield was silent. The roar of war replaced by the moans of the dying Boudicca had lost not just a battle, but a war she had set ablaze with her own hands. They all agree that she disappeared. No chained queen was ever paraded through the streets of Rome, no public execution, no last humiliation. Some claim she drank poison, preferring death than capture, while others believe she became ill and passed away quietly. She just vanished like a storm that extinguished itself, but something remarkable occurred at that time. She transcended her role as queen and became a myth. Rome, horrified and humiliated by the extent of her insurrection, attempted to erase the memory, but it was too late. Boudicca was a martyr, a goddess of battle and vengeance, and her name was now echoed in Britain's holy groves and whispered in tribal songs. There was grudging respect Tacitus for a mother who had stood up to the most powerful empire in the world and caused it to bleed, even among the Romans. However, Roman to the bone depicted her as a great leader who had been wronged by the haughtiness of the empire. Dio wrote of her commanding presence and terrifying speeches, and while they feared her, they also admired her resolve. Over the centuries, Boudica refused to die and would rise again in Victorian statues, Tennyson poems, history textbooks, and classroom lessons. She became a symbol of defiance, particularly for women who saw in her story a fire that couldn't be put out. Even if her body may be lost to history, her voice endures because it screams in the fire, rides with the wind, and reverberates through every soul that has ever risen up to oppression and muttered, "I will not kneel." Her chariot's spiked wheels, tearing through time, became a vehicle of resistance. Her legacy is more than just statues, it's about what she stands for. In London, close to Westminster Bridge, a bronze statue depicts her standing tall on a war chariot with her daughter's eyes fixed on the horizon and wheels raised in defiance beneath her. Although centuries have passed since Boudica disappeared into the mists of history, her shadow still lingers throughout the British Isles. You can see her name carved into monuments, hear her invoked in political speeches, and feel her presence in the obstinate spirit of a land that never truly forgot her. Beyond the totality of her struggles, Boudica became a timeless question that every empire, oppressor, and ruler who loses sight of the people's power must answer. What happens when the people's power is forgotten? Her uprising was not flawless. It was characterized by massacres and bloodshed. Tens of thousands died at the hands of her warriors. But history isn't written by saints, it's carved by those who dare to resist, and resistance by its nature is rarely clean. Still, what makes Boudica endure is not just her war against Rome, it's the fire she lit in the human imagination. A woman who lost everything, and still stood tall, a queen who refused to be defined by the empire that tried to break her, a mother who turned her grief into a sword. Modern historians continue to debate her exact role, her decisions, her motives, but ask any Briton who Boudica was, and they won't recite footnotes. They'll tell you she was the queen who made Rome bleed, the woman who united tribes that had once warred with each other, the warrior who taught the world that dignity can rise even from devastation. And in that she becomes more than historical figure. She becomes symbol of rebellion, of courage, of the unbreakable will to be free. Because even when Rome rebuilt its cities and redrew its maps, it could not erase her. Her light continues to burn in every voice that dares to speak out against oppression, in every soul that would sooner die standing than live on their knees, and in every battle against tyranny. Although Boudica is no longer with us, her legacy endures in the ancient world because disease wasn't always caused by chance. It wasn't just germs, viruses, or rogue cells. Thousands of years later, those reasons would be provided. In the ancient world, illness was a sign of a deeper disturbance rather than just bodily failure. Disease in Mesopotamia was frequently viewed as divine retribution. If a person became ill, it was thought that they had violated a taboo, drawn a curse, or upset the equilibrium between body, mind, soul, and nature. The diagnosing process started with inquiries rather than symptoms. In ancient China, balance took on a more systematic meaning through yin and yang and the 5 elements. Priests and healers collaborated to interpret omens, cast spells, prescribe rites, and prescribe herbal cures. What have you done? Who have you angered? In order to treat a cough, practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine inquired when it began, what time of day it worsened, and what emotions accompanied it. Health was defined as the state of equilibrium between opposing forces. Too much heat, cold, dryness, or moisture would throw the body off. Herbal remedies were used for healing. Grease, acupuncture, and dietary adjustments were used as means of rebalancing the inner cosmos. For centuries, Western medicine was dominated by the physician Hippocrates' theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which linked each humor to a temperament and an element. An excess or deficiency of one would result in both physical symptoms and personality changes. Hippocrates rejected the idea that gods punished people with disease, but he also saw health as harmony. For example, it was claimed that a melancholic had excessive amounts of black bile in all civilizations. One thread was constant. Completeness was a sign of health. Not only the lack of discomfort, but also the existence of equilibrium, whether it was the belief in spiritual possession in African healing practices, or the Indian Ayurvedic concept of doshas in the land of the pyramids and the pharaohs. Medicine was both science and magic. Ancient Egyptian healers known as SW&W were not just physicians, they were sacred intermediaries between the body and the divine. Their medical practices were surprisingly advanced and yet deeply entwined with ritual and magic. The Egyptians believed that although the body could bleed, bruise, and break, its ailments were never purely physical. The spirit, the gods, and even the afterlife played a role in every sickness. Much of what we know about medicine comes from medical texts. Similar to the Ebers Papyrus, which dates to approximately 1550 BCE, this ancient scroll has hundreds of treatments for conditions ranging from cancers to toothaches. Egyptian physicians used fire-sanitized copper tools to perform surgeries, set fractures, treat infections, and drain abscesses. They were also skilled at checking pulses, diagnosing diseases by observing urine and feces, and using a wide range of herbs, many of which are still used today. However, no treatment could begin without the gods' approval. Tom was thought to have given humanity the keys to healing, and the lion-headed goddess of battle and plague was feared and invoked in prayer, since she had the power to either cause epidemics or bring about healing. Incantations were not just words, they were medicine in sound form. One of their greatest tools was honey, which was used as an antiseptic long before bacteria were understood. Wounds were bandaged with it, occasionally combined with resin or lint, and garlic and onions were prescribed for heart health. Castor oil was used as a laxative, and even moldy bread was pressed into infected wounds. Spells were frequently recited over a patient as herbs were applied. An antiquated antibiotic Egyptian physicians treated monarchs as well as commoners centuries before their time, and their abilities were valued internationally. Long before modern medicine emerged, India was already writing its own history of healing. This ancient system, known as Ayurveda, saw the human body not as a machine but as a reflection of the cosmos. In this way, Egyptian physicians were early specialists who treated difficult cases, some focused on the stomach, others on the eyes, or even on spiritual afflictions. However, in all their knowledge, there was no separation between the physical and the sacred. For the ancient Egyptians, healing the body meant pleasing the gods, purifying the soul, and restoring divine balance. For them, healing meant healing the body, not just the illness. A Sanskrit term with roots in the Vedic tradition that refers to the study of life. The three dashas, Vat, Pa, and Kapha, each represent a distinct combination of the five elements: earth, fire, air, and ether. Vat governs movement, Peter controls transformations like digestion, and Kapha oversees structure and stability. Ayurveda is more than just a medical practice. It is a philosophy and a way of living in harmony with nature, seasons, and spirit. Everybody has a different balance of these diseases at birth, and illness develops when this balance is upset by a bad diet, stressful circumstances, or a particular way of living. Over 2,000 years ago, Vedic writings such as the Karaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita were composed. These comprehensive guides provide advice on surgery, obstetrics, psychology, and even physician ethics in addition to herbal medicines. Charaka promoted prevention as the first line of defense and concentrated on internal medicine. But Ayurveda's strength lies in its holistic approach. Healing the body is inseparable from healing the mind and soul. Sushruta is remembered as a pioneer of surgery, having described over 300 surgical procedures and more than 120 surgical instruments, many of which were carved from wood or metal. One of his most amazing techniques was rhinoplasty, which involved reconstructing a nose using a flap of skin from the patient's cheek or forehead. This wasn't cosmetic. Rather, it was frequently used to restore faces that had been mutilated as a form of punishment thousands of years before Western medicine caught up. Yoga breathing techniques, oil massages using pranayama, abhyanga, and plants that promote contemplative fasting, such as ashwagandha and turmeric, tulsi, and neem, were more than just food. They were also life force defenders and medication purifiers. In addition to using herbs to treat a fever, an Ayurvedic healer may also change your sleep schedule, assess your emotional well-being, and cleanse your digestive system. Ayurveda teaches that you are nature and that when you become ill, it is nature's way of bringing you back into balance. In ancient China, vitality was more important than physical appearance. Every living thing was filled with the invisible vital force known as qi, which is pronounced chi. The secret to good health was to make sure that qi flowed freely without obstruction or excess. This fundamental concept would form one of the world's oldest continuous medical systems, known as traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM. In order to comprehend illness, ancient Chinese doctors first had to comprehend nature. They studied the moon's phases, the seasons, animal behavior, and the rotation of the cosmos. From these patterns, two fundamental principles, yin and yang, and the five elements were born. Water, fire, earth, metal, and wood. Yin and yang stood for harmony in everything. Every organ, emotion, and bodily function was categorized under these opposing but complementary forces. Yang was hot, brilliant, and active on the outside, and Yin was cool, dark, and passive on the inside. At that time, their health was a dynamic balance. A fever was an overabundance of Yang, not just a spike in temperature. Fatigue could indicate a Yin depletion. Diagnosis was an art. Doctors used their senses instead of instruments. They checked the tongue, felt the pulse in various places, listened to the voice tone, and inquired about dreams, emotions, and bowel movements. Every detail provided information about the balance or imbalance of qi, and they used a large toolkit to restore health. To release blocked qi and restore flow, acupuncture involves inserting tiny needles into specific locations throughout the body's meridians. Moxibustion was a technique used to warm and promote circulation in cupping herbal formulae by burning the mugwort herb close to these areas. Strict dietary restrictions and Sheng exercises were essential. The foundation of TCM today is still the ancient text hanging, also known as the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, which was assembled some 2,000 years ago. It covered prevention and lifestyle, teaching that emotions like anger, grief, and fear could damage organs, and that emotional balance was necessary for healing in addition to physical treatments. In the temples of ancient Greece and the forums of ancient Rome, medicine began to move away from the divine and into the realm of reason. But even here, the body was still seen as a delicate ecosystem ruled by balance and temperament. At the heart of this worldview stood a theory that would shape Western medicine for more than 1,000 years. The four humors, developed by the Greek physician Hippocrates and later expanded by Roman doctors like Galen. The ancients believed that in order to treat the body, one must treat the climate, the soul, and the invisible energy within in every heartbeat, and that the healer's job was to listen. Each of the humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, correlated to an element, such as air, water, fire, and earth, and to a particular temperament. A healthy person had these fluids in balance, whereas an illness was just the result of having too much or too little of one. For example, if someone was upset and agitated, they may have too much yellow bile. The Greeks believed in the healing power of observation and environment. The Hippocratic Oath, which is still echoed in modern medicine, urged physicians to do no harm, to observe their patients carefully, and to treat the whole person, not just the disease. Hippocrates advised his students to consider the seasons, winds, water quality, and even the patient's mood. Healing sanctuaries, named after the god Asclepius, were scattered throughout the Greek landscape. These were more than hospitals. They were spiritual retreats where patients slept in the hopes of receiving healing dreams. In Rome, medical practice developed further with the rise of Galen, a Greek physician who served gladiators and emperors. He dissected animals to understand anatomy, wrote hundreds of medical texts, and helped standardize humorism throughout the empire, despite some of his ideas being flawed. Ritual purification, exercise, diet, and prayer were all part of the cure. Long before written texts and official schools of medicine existed, indigenous peoples all over the world were using a deeper kind of knowledge that was passed down through stories, visions, and first-hand experience with the natural world to heal their communities. Galen's influence persisted for centuries as Greek medicine, for all its mystical origins, started pushing toward a new idea that the human body was a system complex, yes, but knowable, and that if understood correctly it could be brought back into harmony not through gods alone, but through reason, ritual, and the careful art of healing. Among Native American tribes, healers were referred to as medicine men and women, and their roles went well beyond providing medical care. They served as spiritual mentors and facilitated seasonal cycles and sacred rites. From the Cherokee to the Lakota, storytellers, counselors, and custodians of ancestral knowledge, illness was viewed as a disturbance in the individual's relationship with nature, the tribe, the spirits, or themselves. Healing required more than just herbs. It required reconnection with plants. Every tribe had encyclopedic knowledge of the earth, including which bark to crush for wounds, which leaves to brew for fever, and which roots to chew for discomfort. Cedar sage in order to cleanse the body and spirit, sweetgrass and tobacco were revered in smudging rituals. However, medicine was never just about the ingredient. It was also about intention, ceremony, and respect. Healers frequently collaborated with spiritual forces to conduct sweat lodges. Drumming circles and vision journeys, a violation of taboo spiritual possession or even soul loss may result in disease, a state in which trauma caused a portion of the person's essence to flee. In these situations, rituals such as soul retrieval were carried out, summoning the spirit back by dancing, chanting, or guided hypnosis. Indigenous traditions around the world share a profound respect for nature. In the Amazon rainforest, shamans use potent plant medicines like ayahuasca, a hallucinogenic concoction used for healing insight rather than recreation. In Aboriginal Australia, they believe the plants themselves are teachers, revealing the causes of suffering through visions. Herbs, clays, and customs that have been passed down through the ages are all part of bush medicine. Indigenous identity is still shaped by the ancient age. Here, healing involves striking a balance between song lyrics and body-land ancestors. These systems existed in the songs, dances, and landscapes of the people to indigenous healers. They were never recorded in books. Regardless of language, geography, or belief system, every ancient civilization shared the belief that healing required more than herbs and surgery. It required spirit. Modern medicine may have its machines and labs, but the earth has always been the first pharmacy, and healing is not about curing illness but about remembering who we are. If sickness was viewed as a transgression of sacred forces, or as a form of divine punishment for a soul imbalance in ancient Mesopotamia, ritual served as the gateway to the unseen realm, where genuine healing was thought to begin. People utilized exorcists and priests to combat illnesses long before formal medicine became popular, because they thought that evil spirits or angered gods were to blame. Special figurines were buried beneath buildings to prevent illness, and clay tablets disclosed comprehensive therapeutic rites where chants were whispered as pictures were applied. Before applying honey to a wound or bandaging a limb, the healer would frequently recite prayers to the god of wisdom or Sekhmet, goddess of healing and wrath. In ancient Egypt, rituals were not distinct from treatment. Rather, they were the treatment. Illness wasn't just a physical attack, it was a cosmic imbalance. In many African traditions, healing entailed realigning the sufferer with Mahat, the concept of truth, order, and harmony. Herbs were important, but the unseen world was always consulted first. Even in classical Greek, ritual played a role in the Ascapa sacred healing temples. Patients underwent purification rituals, fasted and prayed at night, slept in Enkoya, and dreamed beneath statues of Asclepius, the god of healing. Gungas or Sangomas used drumming, dancing, and divination to diagnose and cure their patients. They also spoke with ancestors, summoned spirits, and frequently entered trance-like states to travel the spiritual realm on their patients' behalf. Through symbolic acts, people could turn fear into hope, isolation into connection, chaos into control, and more. It also reminded them that they were not alone, even in the age of modern science studies. Ritual was not superstition. Rather, it was structure that gave shape to suffering, a language to pain, and a sense that the illness had meaning. The effect of a placebo, the power of belief, and the healing impact of intention. The ancients didn't need the information because they already understood that sometimes a word spoken in reverence can heal deeper than any blade, because not all wounds are visible, and not all medicine is made of matter. However, the truth is far more impressive and human throughout the ancient world. These early healers practiced surgery with surprising precision. They lacked anesthesia, x-rays, and antiseptics, but they had skill, courage, and a remarkable understanding of the body gained through generations of observation, trial, and frequently brutal necessity. In India, the Sushruta Samhita, written more than 2,000 years ago, described more than 300 surgical procedures. Its author, Sushruta, is regarded as the father of surgery. He explained methods for clearing tumors, realigning bones, fixing hernias, and even doing plastic surgery to rebuild noses. His instruments included sharp, diverse, and well-organized forceps, scalpels, probes, and needles. Many iron or stone Sushruta placed a strong emphasis on cleanliness, surgical preparation, and the value of learning anatomy through dissection, albeit this was frequently restricted to animals. His surgical knowledge extended well beyond India, impacting both Western and Islamic customs. Centuries later, techniques for bandaging wounds, healing dislocated limbs, and draining abscesses are revealed in ancient Egyptian surgical knowledge combined with ceremonial papyrus manuscripts. They even conduct trepanation, which involves making a hole in the skull to release pressure or heal head injuries. Bronze knives, bone saws, and cauterizing rods have been discovered in tombs. In pre-Columbian Peru, archaeologists have found hundreds of trapped skulls, often from warriors injured in battle. Some surgeries were remarkably successful in some regions, with over 80% of patients surviving based on bone regeneration. These early surgeons may have used cocoa leaves or fermented maize beer to dull pain, along with herbal antiseptics. In the Greco-Roman world, Galen advanced surgical techniques by studying injured gladiators and dissecting animals. It is amazing how many skulls exhibit signs of healing, indicating that the patient survived. His understanding of the circulatory system and neurological system established the groundwork for subsequent anatomy. We live in a world of digital diagnostics, robotic surgeries, and genetic mapping, where we can scan a body in seconds and send prescriptions across oceans with a tap. However, in the quiet corners of modern medicine, the whispers of the ancient world still reverberate. Roman military surgeons used cautery clamps and ligatures to treat wounds on the battlefield efficiently. Surgery was always dangerous, but it was also respected. It was the domain of those brave enough to cut into life itself, hopping to draw health from pain. In yoga studios, Ayurveda Chinese herbal remedies found in drugstore aisles and hospital smudging rituals honoring patients' customs in operating rooms. We use precision devices that have their roots in Sushrutas iron instruments. And medical students still swear a version of the Hippocratic Oath promising to do no harm, just as their Greco-Roman ancestors did. The foundations of integrative health, such as holistic care, preventative medicine, and mind-body connection, have their roots in the knowledge of ancient societies who viewed healing as a relationship rather than a task. Even modern science has come full circle, with research increasingly supporting the ancients' theories that emotional trauma and stress isolation can impair immunity, interfere with sleep, and result in physical pain. Originally a spiritual practice, meditation is currently being researched for its impact on brain health. Forest bathing derived from Shinto and indigenous nature practices is prescribed for anxiety, and the placebo effect healing powered by belief continues to puzzle researchers who once dismissed it. It's easy to see ancient medicine as outdated superstition, folklore, primitive guesswork. But when we look closer, we see something profound, a worldview that treated illness not just as a broken machine, but as a disruption in being a signal that something somewhere was out of harmony, and that idea still matters because medicine isn't only about treatment, it's about meaning, about comfort, about being seen, and understood. The ancients knew this instinctively. Whether they used chance, needles, leaves, or blades, they understood that healing was sacred today. As we push further into the future of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and personalized medicine, perhaps we are not leaving the ancient world behind, perhaps. We are returning to it with new tools, but the same human heart, a heart that still longs for balance. For wholeness, for healing not just of body, but of spirit. Her name drifts through history like a half-remembered melody. Sappho, a poetess from the island of Lesbos, born sometime around 630 BCE, whose voice once stirred the hearts of listeners under starlit skies, and whose words even in fragments still echo with longing, unlike the grand warriors and kings of ancient Greece. The human soul, not the battlefield, was Sappho's realm. She wrote about love, jealousy, beauty, sorrow, ecstasy, and longing. She recorded the ephemeral moments, a gaze, a flush, a tremble, and preserved them in rhyme like pressed flowers. Delicate yet timeless, little much is known about her life. No journals or photos exist. We have traces. A few passages that have been saved by ancient scholars, quotations that have been incorporated into other works, and the remains of papyrus scrolls that have been lost to time. But these pieces still shine. The Greek philosopher Plato called her the 10th muse. Centuries later, poets, translators, and dreamers would seek her, piecing her life together like an unfinished song. Sappho was likely born into a noble family on Lesbos, an island in the northeastern Aegean Sea. This was a place of music and learning, where poetry was woven into the fabric of social life. She may have had siblings, a daughter, and even political enemies. Though the records are vague, she lived through exile and unrest. Moments of silence and moments of song. Her world was one where most women's voices were confined to the home or stifled altogether. But Sappho defied silence. She stood apart not with rebellion, but with beauty. She wrote in the Yalic dialect in short, vivid lyrics, designed to be sung to the lyre. Her style was intimate, rich with imagery. Evening star, you bring back all that the shining day has scattered. Words like these outlived empires. And then as quietly as she appeared in the records, she faded. Much of her work is lost, burned, buried, or dismissed. But what remains proves one thing: she didn't need monuments. Her poems were her monument. And today, when we speak of passion in verse, of love without shame, of longing that defies centuries, we are still whispering the name Sappho. To understand Sappho, you must first understand Lesbos, the island that cradled her voice. Lesbos was no backwater in the ancient Greek world. It was a flourishing hub of art, music, and philosophy, with its fertile valleys, olive groves, and coastal Wind scented with salt and flowers in addition to being a physical paradise, Lesbos was also a cultural treasure. It wasn't Athens, but it didn't have to be. It had a slower, more sensual pace and was rich in lyric history. Here, music wasn't ornamentation, rather it was devotion, and the tales and ows reverberated throughout temples and houses. Sappho's voice was created in this world of sound and nature, where poetry was sung rather than read. She lived in the city of Mytilene, where politics and the arts flourished. The island was home to poets, philosophers, warring groups, and shifting alliances. Because of political upheaval, Sappho herself was once deported, possibly to Sicily. However, it was always Lesbos that drew her home. It was her muse. Lesbos was also a place of female community, uncommon in the ancient world, where aristocratic girls were taught music, poetry, and ritual. According to some scholars, Sappho led a kind of thesos, a circle or school where young women learned the art of lyric poetry, dance, and devotion to the goddess Aphrodite. This was not formal education as we know it. Rather, it was a sacred, creative sisterhood where bonds were formed that were emotional, intellectual, and possibly romantic. Sappho wrote directly to these women, not as abstract muses but as actual presences in her life. She addressed them by name, mourned their departures, celebrated their beauty, and confessed her love with searing honesty. In one fragment, she writes, "I have not had one word from her, I beg you bring her back to me." Though time would eventually skew her memory by framing it with scandal or conjecture, these lyrics originate from a lived world, a circle of women singing by lamplight, rather than myth or drama. Lesbos served as the fertile ground for her truth, growing not only as a geographical site, but also as a cultural hub for feminine expression and passionate creativity. In a time when Homer's great epics extolled gods and heroes and men filled scrolls with tales of battles and conquests, Sappho did more than simply exist on Lesbos. She became its breath, heart, and voice. Sappho was one of the first poets in Western history to write in the first person, not only recounting events but also feeling them. She wrote about the heart, not about war, but about a trembling hand, a shy glance, and a voice that made her body shiver. What she felt was love, longing, jealousy, tenderness, and desire. The most astounding of all is that she wrote as a woman to women about women in ancient Greece. In that time, women's voices were frequently restricted to the home or completely silenced in public life, literature, politics, and philosophy. However, Sappho broke through these barriers with rhythm rather than rebellion. Her poetry created a private universe where emotion was not weakness but power, and she did something radical within that space by naming the women she loved. She didn't reduce them to symbols. She didn't speak in metaphors. She remembered their laughter, their perfume, and the way they braided their hair. In one fragment, she describes the feeling of seeing a beloved who is equal to the gods, that man who sits next to you, listens to your sweet voice, and watches your beautiful laughter. Oh, it makes my heart race. Her words carried the erotic but never the vulgar. She wrote of sensuality with the care of a painter, the curve of a neck, the softness of sleep, the way moonlight touched skin. She didn't separate beauty from intimacy. Instead, they were one. Later centuries frequently misunderstood or censored her. Some tried to erase her queerness. Others mythologized her heartbreak into tragedy. But none of that lessens the truth of her voice. Sappho is the onlooker listening to the woman she adores as she speaks to another. Her jealousy is quiet, aching, and deeply human in just a few lines. Not only did Sappho write poetry, but she also composed music for the soul. She was a woman who fearlessly and honestly wrote about love, not just in theory, but as someone who had experienced it firsthand and honestly. Her poems were never intended to be read aloud. In ancient Greece, poetry was alive and vibrated with sound and breath. Sappho was the undisputed master of lyric poetry. Her poems were written in Ialic Greek, a regional dialect rich in softness and rhythm. Her preferred meter, now known as the Sapphic stanza, flowed with a particular beat, 3 long lines followed by a shorter, punchy one like a sigh at the end of a longing thought. The lyric was a whisper, a confession, a love letter sung beneath fig trees or in candle-lit rooms. The voice carried the words like a breeze over the sea, and this was the essence of lyric poetry and the source of the word lyrical. She would have performed these songs in front of female students, their companions, and possibly even priestesses. These gatherings, which may have been ceremonial or educational in nature, were also places of freedom where emotion, song, and body were not fragmented but whole. It was delicate and melodic, like the rising and falling of breath during a quiet moment between lovers. Sappho taught others the craft of composing, producing not only poetry but also a culture that sounded like the gentle twang of strings. Her voice's distinct accent, and the audience's silence as they hung on every word. Many of her poems open not with statements, but with questions or invocations like the start of a conversation or a prayer. Come to me now, O golden-throned Aphrodite, and free me from hard care. These were poems that reached up to gods and inward to desire. And yet they feel surprisingly modern. You could set them to music today, and they'd still stir something raw and real. Sappho turned poetry into song. And in doing so, she reminded the world that emotion is music, that every heartache, every thrill of touch or tremble of voice deserves a melody, and hers is one still echoing centuries later. For every line of Sappho's poetry, we have today dozens, perhaps hundreds, are lost. What remains are fragments, shards of emotion, and sound phrases ripped from their original songs, drifting across time. Some are complete stanzas, others are mere whispers, a single word, a sliver of longing, a closing thought, without a beginning. And yet even these broken pieces pulse with life like embers glowing in the ash of something once brilliant. Why did so much vanish? Time, war, and deliberate destruction. Sappho's works were once collected into 9 volumes organized in the famed Library of Alexandria. These were likely copied and recited throughout the classical world. But with the fall of that library, much of ancient literature was lost later. As Christian influence rose, many works deemed pagan or immoral were suppressed, neglected, or intentionally burned. Sappho's poetry, filled with passion, especially same-sex love, made her a target. Medieval period, she became a ghost. Her name survived, but her voice was nearly silenced only through quotations by other authors preserved in grammars, commentaries, or philosophical works. Did bits of her poetry escape extinction? These fragments were often cited for their style or vocabulary, not for their emotional force. Yet the feelings still bled through. Then came the papyri in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Archaeologists digging in the sands of Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, uncovered thousands of scraps of ancient manuscripts, among them torn and faded lines of Sappho, bits of songs that had not been seen for over 1,000 years. More discoveries followed in 2004. A nearly complete poem was found on a papyrus wrapped around a mummy in Germany. Each recovery felt like a resurrection. And yet so much remains missing. We read her today in echoes. What we long for is not just what she wrote, but what she might have said if history had let her speak without interruption. Still, there's something hauntingly fitting in this survival through fragments. Sappho wrote about impermanence, about fleeting moments, about beauty that slips through the fingers like sand. And so, perhaps, it is appropriate that her poetry arrives to us not as a monument, but as a mystery, a puzzle pieced together by lovers of language, of music, of the heart. A voice once drowned in fire, still burning, since Sappho wrote about love, and not the kind. History was comfortable remembering that much of her poetry focused on deep affection and desire for women. She praised their beauty, mourned their absence, confessed jealousy, and celebrated their intimacy in her world. This was not unusual in the cultural setting of Lesbos, especially among aristocratic women. Sappho's poetry was too honest to avoid judgment during her lifetime. She was praised and celebrated even as a master of lyric poetry, and Plato referred to her as the 10th muse, placing her among the divine. Later generations, particularly those raised under Roman Christian and Victorian ideals, battled with this and chose to rewrite her tale rather to face her truth. Close emotional and potentially amorous ties were allowed and even praised. Medieval writers disregarded her Renaissance, and translators softened her language, calling her a tragic romantic who was heartbroken over a man. They even created the myth that she died by jumping off a cliff over the love of a ferryman named Phaon, a story that doesn't appear in her real work. This made-up story was meant to hide her queerness and make her suffering more bearable and her desires more conventional. Some critics denounced her as completely immoral, while others reduced her poetry to purely didactic or platonic. But she continued despite the controversy. When open mention of same-sex relationships was still frowned upon in the 19th century, Sappho's name endured, and her legacy subtly evolved into a coded emblem for gay identity. She became, without intending to, a figure of resistance, a poetic ancestor to those whose loves were silenced, and even now discussions reverberate about who she was: a teacher, a lover, a myth, a threat. But perhaps the more pertinent question is why we are still afraid of her truth. The terms sapphic and lesbian became terms for romantic love between women, rooted directly in her name and her home. If there was one divine presence that hovered over Sappho's life and work, it was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible desire. Aphrodite wasn't just a myth. She was a muse, a confidant, and even a sort of companion in moments of passion and heartbreak. Many of Sappho's most powerful verses are prayers to Aphrodite, invocations. Sappho didn't write to fit into preconceived notions. Instead, she named beauty, confessed longing, and lived through verse. Her scandal came from her honesty rather than her actions. In her most well-known surviving poem, Ode to Aphrodite, she makes arguments in rhyme when the weight of love becomes too much to bear. Instead of merely praising the goddess, Sappho addresses her directly, almost as if she were a friend who has heard my suffering before. If you have ever responded to my voice in the past, please release me from hardship and fulfill all of my heart's desires. There is no shame in being vulnerable or afraid to show them. Sappho's love is never presented as weak or sinful. Rather, it is heavenly and holy enough to summon a goddess from the sky in the ancient world. Aphrodite dominated attraction and seduction and wasn't simply about romance. She didn't idealize love. Instead, she lived inside its contradictions, writing of its sweetness and sting, beauty and cruelty. In another poem, she describes how love shook my soul like the wind on the mountain troubling the oak trees. The chemistry between bodies and the pain of separation called on her to realize that love could wound just as much as it could thrill. Because Aphrodite is at the center of her emotional universe, love in this context isn't kind. Rather, it's a violent elemental entity that rips through the self without consent. Aphrodite wasn't an abstract deity. Rather, she was a mirror and a force that reflected back all the intensity, confusion, and beauty of the human heart. In every line of Sappho's verse, the goddess of love listens and responds, just like in her poetry. Sappho transformed longing into something mythic by blurring the boundaries between the personal and the divine, between everyday emotion and cosmic force. Nobody is certain of Sappho's precise age, when she passed away, or even where she lived her last years. Her death is a mystery shrouded in folklore. There is no historical evidence to support the claim that she died peacefully on Lesbos, surrounded by the sea and the songs she loved. Later Roman poets, in particular, created tragic fables that she leaped to her death from the white cliffs of Lefata, heartbroken over an unrequited love for the attractive Pharamond Phaon. It appears to have been created more as a means for a male-dominated literary tradition to reinterpret her love and suffering as a heterosexual tragedy, transforming the strong, poetic voice of a woman who loved women into a victim of unrequited love for a man. It may have had a tidy conclusion, but it was a false one. The truth is deeper and simpler. Sappho vanished as discreetly as she came, but her contributions endured for generations. She was studied by philosophers, cited by playwrights, and performed throughout the ancient Greek world. Her poetry was collected in 9 books, which for a while served as a wealth of lyric verse. Her reputation was comparable to Homer's, but with the emergence of the Roman Empire and the subsequent domination of Christian morals, history is unkind to voices that question its conventions. Sappho's overtly sentimental and sensuous poetry, particularly those that celebrated female love, lost popularity and was never again reproduced. Her books were abandoned to deteriorate in libraries that would eventually collapse or burn down. Some people think that early church authorities purposefully destroyed her works because they thought her songs were harmful. By the Middle Ages, her name was still there, but her words had mostly disappeared. She was revived not via myth but through survival. Her death may have been lost to time, but her disappearance was never complete. It would take more than 1,000 years before pieces of her poetry were discovered again, either in old grammars or recovered from Egyptian trash heaps. Sappho didn't need a heroic death because her poems were already immortal, and in the spaces where her words once existed, we can still feel the shape of her spirit yearning, unfinished but never truly gone. She lingered in whispers, stolen lines, scribbled in margins, and the unrelenting ache of voices that refused to be forgotten. Perhaps Sappho's life is lost in the darkness. Scholars pored over her fragments during the Renaissance, marveling at her delicate command of emotion during the Romantic era. Her verses are fragmented and incomplete, but her influence has never diminished. In fact, it has only grown stronger like a candle that flickers but refuses to go out in every age. As discussions about gender and identity started to resurface in the 19th and 20th centuries, poets such as Byron and Shelley used her name. Sappho became a representation of queer tenacity, feminine talent, and emotional liberation. Her name endures in language itself. Sapphic is a worldwide identity that was first used to define passionate love between lesbian women who were transported from their island of birth. These statements are more than simply words. They are reflections of her life, demonstrating that a voice may change our understanding of expression and love even after millennia. Artists, writers, and musicians are still drawn to her. Painters have pictured her at the lyre, bathed in moonlight. Poets have translated her time and time again, searching for the pulse beneath the words. Contemporary authors have reimagined her, reclaimed her, and brought her back to life in plays, novels, and songs. And through it all, one thing is evident. Sappho speaks to something universal. It doesn't matter that her poems are broken, that her biography is hazy. What matters is the emotion that burns beneath the words. The trembling joy of desire, the ache of separation, the sacredness of beauty. These are feelings we all carry. She simply found a way to sing them. Perhaps that is her true immortality, not the marble statues or the academic footnotes. Sappho's gift was more than just poetry, it was presence. She transformed longing into an art form and made feeling into a form of truth. By doing this, she transcended her role as a poet and became a mirror for anyone who has ever loved deeply or secretly or against the will of the world. As long as people's hearts break and heal through language, Sappho will continue to be felt as well as remembered.